Hello and welcome to a happy New Year's Eve edition of On Iowa Politics. This week, the top political stories of 2022. Hi, I'm James Lynch of the Cedar Rapids Gazette, and with me today are Tom Barton of the Quad City Times. Good morning, Tom.
Good morning.
Amie Rivers of the Waterloo Cedar-Falls Courier. Good morning, Amie.
Good morning, James. Happy New Year.
And Erin Murphy, Statehouse Bureau Chief for Lee Newspapers. Good morning, Erin.
Good morning, James.
And Gazette Opinion Editor Todd Dorman. Good morning, Todd.
Good morning.
You can find us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and subscribe to On Iowa Politics wherever you find your podcast. So we've been staring into our magic 8 balls, studying tea leaves and consulting the constellations to decide what will be the top Iowa political stories of the coming year. Things like the reinstatement of President Donald Trump, for example. Erin, let's get started here. What do you think the top Iowa political news stories will be in the coming year, in 2022? What we'll be talking about a year from now?
One of the big ones, and there's any numbers, which is good because there's 5 of us that got to talk about this. So one of the ones that I'll be watching for is the fate of the first in the nation status for the Iowa caucuses, in particularly on the Democratic side. As ever, there's a certain degree of unrest among the national Democrats about Iowa being first, especially on the Democratic side. What's new this time around is the recent, it's the holiday season, so let's be nice and say kerfuffle that took place with the 2020 caucuses. And so that groundswell, that movement to displace Iowa from first in the nation has really grown this time around. And so the DNC in 2022 will be having some big meetings and possibly starting those discussions about the nominating calendar for 2024. And it will be interesting to monitor that and see if anything comes of it this time around. I will note that we just recently here had a story from Politico where maybe it sounds like the temperature is coming back down a little bit in the room for a couple of reasons. The story talks about national Democrats saying not so much that they're fine with Iowa being first, but more that they feel like they have bigger fish to fry right now. And President Biden appears to be headed towards running for re-election anyways, which means there's not really going to be a competitive Democratic primary / caucus. So maybe at least for the time being that the pitchforks are not quite as well lit, but it will be interesting to see as the year goes along if that maintains or if that hunger to make a change manifests itself and we see the National Democratic Party making moves to actually change the calendar. That's obviously a huge deal for Iowa and Iowa politics, and something that'll be worth watching, and I think will, one way or the other, be a pretty significant story in 2022.
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting lines in that Politico story about the fate of the caucuses was the one, I think it was the South Carolina party official who said, Iowa is effed. It's just a matter of if they're effed in 2024 or 2028. So
Right.
This is, it probably will continue to be a top news story.
Yeah, it may just be a stay of execution, not a granting of parole.
Not a commutation.
Right.
I think the quote was from a unnamed DNC member. But I think the other interesting line in that story that stood out to me was from Iowa Democratic strategist Jeff Link, talking about how, since the 80s, right after a caucus, there's a lot of energy to do something different. And then the reality sets in that you have to get 49 states to agree on what the alternative is, and it's harder to change it than it is to leave it as it is. And I guess the interesting thing to watch for, and that may come out next year, is, okay, so what is that alternative? Do you I don't know, elevate South Carolina on the calendar? What other, I don't know, states do you bring in or move up on the calendar? I think that'll be interesting in how much agreement you can get from within the party, within the DNC to agree on some sort of, I don't know, new scheduler framework.
Yeah, I thought that line stood out to me, though, but mostly I've since been in contact with my lawyers to see if I can sue Jeff Link for plagiarism, because I know I've said that here on the podcast and on Iowa Press before, too. That sounded too familiar. I think he ripped me off. But seriously, that is how kind of always been the case. The point is there's 48 states that agree Iowa shouldn't be first. Then when you ask them, okay, what should we do? All of a sudden that unity starts to dissolve. So...
yeah,
like I said on Twitter, hashtag inertia. Half the reason Iowa stays first is because nobody can figure out an alternative.
Yeah, and one of the states that probably is in Iowa's corners is New Hampshire, where the Secretary of State, Bill Gardner, has said, we're going before anybody else. They have a state law that says they have a primary before anybody else does. So, whatever the DNC decides, New Hampshire may just say we're sticking to our schedule, and that'll be something that have to work out. And I don't get the impression that New Hampshire is really in a bargaining mood over their first in the nation primary status.
Is it possible you could freeze out New Hampshire if you're the party? Like you could basically say, okay, New Hampshire, you can have your primary like in, 3 years before the election. And then we're just going to ignore that until, we have, our agreed upon primary, at a later date. Would that essentially make it irrelevant?
They could do that. And I think the Republican Party did something like that with, was it Florida, who wanted to have their caucus or primary early, and they said, sure, go ahead, but we're not going to seat your delegates. Now, in the end, I think they ended up seating some of the delegates. So the parties can do that. They can just say, yeah, you can have your primary in New Hampshire, but we're not going to, recognize the results. We're not going to seat your delegates. And then New Hampshire Democrats might say, like, well, maybe we ought to, think about changing this. But I think and I feel compelled now that Erin has threatened us with legal action, that I'll give him credit for saying that, inertia may rule the day.
That's right.
It's easier to do nothing than to try and...
Right. Yeah. I also got to laugh, Jim, as you said, it depends on whether New Hampshire's in a whether they're in a bargaining mood. That made me chuckle, because I think if you ask Iowa Democrats who have been trying to finesse the caucuses and make them more accommodating, but not make them more like an actual primary election, to ask them how much they feel New Hampshire Democrats are in a bargaining mood ever over their spot and their role and what the caucuses and a primary should look like. I don't think bargaining is in their vocabulary when it comes to their first in the nation.
Yep. Tom, what's the top news story from your perspective?
God, I hate to say it, but COVID.
Right.
Yeah. I know,
He's
right?
But
I mean, you look at the numbers. You look at what's the introduction of the Omicron variant, and today you had, at least here in the Quad Cities, but we've seen this across the state. You had hospital officials put out a brochure, and essentially begging and pleading with people to take this pandemic seriously, to get vaccinated, to wear masks. They talked about cases are at the highest level they've been at since the surge in November of 2020. Hospital beds are full. ICUs are full. Ventilators are running short. Critically ill patients, some on ventilators, are waiting hours in the emergency departments to be admitted or transferred. Staff is overwhelmed. There are, critical or serious hospital staffing shortages that they're trying to deal with, on top of just the physical and mental exhaustion of these frontline healthcare workers. And so sadly, I that's the top story, and will be the top story until, as one physician here in our area wrote in a letter to the editor of the Quad City Times, this will continue to be the top story and still be the case until people stop believing the COVID pseudoscience. And until politicians and lawmakers, stop providing a platform for for that pseudoscience to spread, and stop providing a platform for people to downplay or not take this pandemic seriously.
Right. What was the number the other day?
Also the year that COVID becomes endemic, which is to say, is that when it's going to become, so ubiquitous around the world that it'll just become like the flu? Is 2020?
That seems. Yeah, I mean, I can see that happening where you'll get a flu shot and a COVID shot every year, and as these new variants emerge, that may be the case. Now, I saw a headline today. I didn't get a chance to read the story, but apparently the Army has developed a COVID vaccine that they say will basically cover all the variants, which certainly would be good news if people get it.
All the variants so far that we've identified.
Well, yeah. I mean, that's always sort of the asterisk so far. But certainly I think COVID is going to continue to be a story, and unfortunately,
and you're going to continue to see legal and political battles carry over and play out in 2022 over workplace vaccine mandates, and that issue is at some point probably going to come to a head in 2022.
Well, and there's talk among some state legislators to introduce a bill that would prevent like employers from demanding or requiring vaccinations of their employees. I don't know how that's going to go over with the business groups that opposed the previous legislation that lawmakers approved on saying if you quit your job because you don't want to get a vaccine, you can get unemployment benefits. So they may not look on this legislation very favorably, but those sorts of things are out there, and until people actually choose to believe the science rather than the pseudoscience, it'll continue to be a problem. Amie, your top political story?
I'm up. All right.
Yeah.
So I wanted to talk about potential legislation that's coming through. It's not as sexy, but it's totally just as sexy. So basically, a couple stories that I did with legislation that was introduced at least, but didn't pass for whatever reason, but is likely to come back next year. So two things. One, the so opponents call it an anti-trans bill. Sandy Salmon would call it the Saving Women's Sports Act, which is actually legislation from the Alliance Defending Freedom, which they've passed out to several conservative states, several of whom have passed such legislation or similar legislation like it. She introduced this last year and then immediately withdrew it. I think just to put it on people's radars, they want to kind of suss out the NCAA. The NCAA has said if states that put in this legislation could be at risk of losing NCAA tournaments. I don't know if that or how that affects Iowa as a whole, but I think that they wanted to sort of check that out and see other states do this and see if it was successful before they brought it back. But she told me last year she definitely wants to bring this bill back. The other one is the anti-PSO bill, which is what supporters would call it. Of course, this is a big issue for Cedar Falls. Cedar Falls has the first, so far only in the state, public safety officer model. Basically, your combined police fire department cross-trained as one department. because they're the first, there's a ton of pushback, including in Cedar Falls. This is an election issue every year since it's been basically fully implemented in the last 4 or 5 years. So basically, the recourse for people is the legislature. They did look like they were on board with this last year. It passed the House by a super wide margin. Even Cedar Valley legislatures were in favor of this. Bob Kressig represents Cedar Falls, and he said he's in favor of it. He's got some concerns with the program himself. So this is very much, something that's going to come back next year. And the bill is so narrowly tailored. It basically says if you're a Regent University city, you cannot have such a combined department. Obviously, this doesn't affect that many cities. Ames doesn't have a combined department. Iowa City doesn't have a combined department. So this is definitely just a shot across the bow to Cedar Falls. The good news is that basically the anti-PSO contingent didn't really win in November as far as the city leadership. So it might be an issue that gets punted back. But because it got so much traction in the House, it also very well has a chance of sailing through. So those are the two I'll be watching for sure here.
All right. It's interesting in talking to Speaker of the House, Pat Grassley, this week. We asked him about a number of bills that aren't necessarily coming from leadership. The trans legislation. We didn't talk specifically about the PSO situation. But his response a number of times was, well, just because somebody says they want a bill doesn't mean it's going to happen. Just because somebody, sponsors a bill doesn't mean it's going to happen. And which is absolutely true. But when the Speaker of the House is saying that, it seems like, yeah, that's probably not going to happen. So it's going to be interesting to watch, how they handle Sandy Salmon's bill on banning trans athletes from participating at the high school and college levels. If they're already saying, well, anybody can say anything, but that doesn't make it a law.
Do you think he's also saying it in order to not necessarily mobilize that opposition quite yet? Because obviously they would have an impetus to keep that tamped down.
Right. And maybe he's looking down the road and saying, heck, Sandy's going to run for the Senate in 2022. So, I'll let the Senate worry about it, and
Sure.
when she gets over there. And they're probably more predisposed to it than the House is. So, if he can mollify her for one more session, then it's somebody else's problem.
Yeah, that's very true. It could be possible. Yeah.
Well, I think whether we like it or not, one of the big stories of 2022 is going to be elections. The midterms are coming up, and we've got a full slate of candidates or elections here with the Senate, governor, the U.S. House, and legislative races that will dominate our agendas through the spring, summer, and fall. It's it seems like Iowa's a pretty red state, so I expect that those Republicans in office stand a pretty good chance of getting reelected. The Republicans this week have been talking about a poll done by For Progress Iowa, a left-leaning group here, that showed that Senator Grassley would defeat Abby Finkenauer something like 59 to 39%. That the Governor Reynolds would win by like 3 or 4 percentage points. So they've been crowing about that this week. I'm sure we'll see more and more polls throughout the coming year, giving us plenty of fodder for future editions of On Iowa Politics. But before we get there, we need to ask Todd, what's at the top of the charts for 2022?
Well, I think we've all seen the movie Groundhog Day. And so we're, I've Got You, Babe is going to play on our clock radio January 1st, and we're going to find that COVID is still running rampant, and we'll be wondering what potential reckless things the legislature will decide to do, and we've got high stakes elections, which we seem to, even in 2001 locally and in other states, we had high stakes elections. And so, Amie mentioned the transgender sports ban. I think the even more, frightening possibility is that they're going to take gender identity out of the Civil Rights Code, which some lawmakers are pushing for. Are they gonna do some sort of abortion ban that's triggered by a Roe v. Wade, strike down in the Supreme Court? Uh, are they gonna make a felony offense for teachers and school staff who disseminate books that they think are obscene? I mean, so they could go pretty far. I mean, on some of this stuff, cooler heads have prevailed in recent years. I mean, because you have the business community and lots of economic development folks who look at this stuff and say, please don't pass this and make Iowa like a civil rights pariah state, where we can't get an NCAA tournament, where we can't get where progressive companies won't move, where young professionals won't want to live because they don't agree with this stuff. So I mean, at the same time, there's the This Is Iowa campaign, which shows a very different state than what we hear on the floor of the legislature, where they don't take on a lot of pictures of people enjoying the natural resources, but no mention that the water's dirty. So as far as the elections are concerned, yeah, I mean, I agree that it's a red state. I actually think the gubernatorial race will be more interesting maybe than some people think. Um, I think there are a lot of issues out there that Democrats can capitalize on. I mean, we've got a state where the prison system is overpopulated and understaffed. We've got a mental health system that needs help. The federal government's criticizing the state for keeping too many people in institutions instead of integrating them into communities. The training school in Eldora has had problems, although it seems they're maybe making some progress. So there's just all of these kind of fundamental governmental roles that seem to be sort of sort of cracks are emerging, and maybe those are the places where Democrats can criticize the Republican governor, and if COVID continues and people feel like things are on the wrong track, that's never good for an incumbent. It'll be bad for Joe Biden, but it could also be bad for Kim Reynolds.
Yeah, that's a good. If I can just tack on to that, if we are allowed in this format of what's going to be the biggest political story of 2022, if we are allowed hypotheticals, if Democrats win one of those two elections, that locks this discussion down. If Chuck Grassley or Kim Reynolds are defeated next year, that's the biggest political story of 2022 in Iowa, hands down, short of James Lynch announcing he's running for president or something just crazy like that.
Huge if true.
So that's, Democrats have their challenges in both races, certainly in the Senate race. I think Todd's right. Everybody, there are signals that Kim Reynolds will be tough to beat, but at the same time, I think we sometimes lose sight that she won by a whopping 2.8 percentage points 4 years ago, when that was before COVID and any number of new issues, to Todd's point, that Democrats will be able to raise and talk about. So if Democrats are able to win that race and undo the Republican trifecta at the Statehouse, that's it. That's game over for this discussion. That's it.
Well,
that's the story.
The abortion issue in and of itself could change some dynamics. I mean, I know we're always talking about, well, how are suburban voters going to vote? And that's one of those issues. I mean, you see the polling, the majority of Iowans, I think it's like 59% in the Iowa poll, said abortion should be legal in all or at least most circumstances, some circumstances. And if the Republican brand basically is we're banning abortion in 28 states and all of the problems that's going to cause, and taking away a right that women have had for 50 years, I don't think that's going to necessarily help Republicans beyond their pro-life base, which is already with them on that issue. So I think they risk, with stuff like that, they risk alienating other voters.
For every action, there is a reaction. Yeah.
And always beware of the coronation, because sometimes they don't work out that way.
Yes. Indeed. And I just want to put to rest one of those predictions from Erin, that I have no intentions of running for president.
I would have voted for you, James.
Well, oh, gee, I'll have to reconsider.
I mean, you gotta say, never say never, but that is not my plan at this point.
That's right.
At least for 2022.
I've decided to run for president so I can spend less time with my family.
Yes.
At my wife's request.
Frankly, we've been holed up during the pandemic, and it's I need to get out.
Any excuse. Well, that's it for this edition of On Iowa Politics. If any of these predictions come to pass, or I should say when they come to pass, we'll talk about them on a future edition of On Iowa Politics. If you enjoy the broadcast, tell a friend and subscribe to us wherever you find your podcasts. Send your fan mail to podcast@thegazette.com. And don't forget that the work of everyone you heard today can be found on the pages and websites of the Quad City Times, the Waterloo Cedar-Falls Courier, Sioux City Journal, Mason City Globe Gazette, Muscatine Journal, Council Bluffs Daily Nonpareil, and the Cedar Rapids Gazette. Lojo Russo will take us out. If you know an Iowa band or musician who should be on our show, send us a sound file and subscribe to On Iowa Politics. For Erin, Amie, Todd, Tom, and our producer Stephen, I'm James Lynch. Thanks for listening. Be well. Happy New Year.
Everything on? Are we recording? Sitting in my favorite corner cafe, drinking coffee, and I'm daydreaming. Looking out the window, watching as the wind blows away. Listen to the singer singing softly about heartache, and I'm thinking, which way does the sign show? Which way will my life go today? And the jasmine wind blows through my dreams, covers me in its warm caress. Sweet as honey, smooth as cream is my jasmine wind. Water clear and cold runs down the street beneath the ice floe, and I am remembering the time when life was so slow, a time when dreams were a stone's throw away. Lay down on a hillside in the tall grass beneath the blue sky, and I'm wondering, where did all the time go? Why does it seem all so far away? And the jasmine wind blows through my dreams, covers me in its warm caress. Sweet as honey, smooth as cream is my jasmine wind. My jasmine, sitting in my favorite corner cafe, drinking coffee, and I'm searching